So I wanted to kind of give some context for some of my background and my ongoing relationship with songwriting and kind of how I ended up stumbling upon this outlet. So I've been really into music as long as I've been able to talk. If anything, I feel like I sang before I talked. And I was trying to like write silly songs when I was 4 and 5 years old, 6, 7, 8, and they usually didn't make sense. So they'd just be mumbling melodies. And but it's still fun. And then as I was getting to high school, I wrote about heartbreak, and most of my expression and kind of journaling or music was about people that didn't want to be my boyfriend, because that's like the pinnacle of devastation when you're a child. And got to college, studied music, got out of college, and I guess the story takes kind of an unusual turn because I went to a holistic dentist randomly, and I just out of curiosity, just to see what she might have to say. And she's doing this body scan, and she's like, "Oh, I see you've got some issue here and here, and your legs are uneven," which everyone's legs are kind of uneven. I digress. But she's like, "Something happened to you 10 years ago. You've been disconnected ever since, and you need to reconnect." And I was thrown off because she specifically said 10 years ago, and I had experienced something very pivotal 10 years ago. So I was like, maybe she's not crazy. And she recommended a meditation retreat. Long story short, I was a carnivore. It was a vegetarian retreat, and I couldn't go. So I was trying to find, what other way can I reconnect with myself, with what I have around me, what I have available, without being able to do this really beautiful meditation thing. And I chose songwriting. And the more that I've gotten into it, the more that the outlet has kind of helped me expand different thresholds and different categories. And I specifically love the word threshold because I find it to be very, it's not about whether you're good or bad at something. It's whether you're comfortable or uncomfortable with something. So, you're starting as this orb of a human, and you're interacting with different categories of your existence, of your life. And art is a way that each of these categories can kind of move around as you learn things. So let's say you're just learning music and you're just learning about how melodies work. At first, you might only appreciate certain neighboring tones and gaps and skips. And then eventually your threshold for what you like about melody starts to evolve as you learn and listen to more things, and your ears get acquainted with more sounds. And so over time you might have different types of gaps and different types of neighbor tones and different patterns of those things, because your threshold for melody is evolving. And I'm so excited to see Beth here, because inside of your own relationship to music, you have a very beautiful relationship with harmony. And I mean, also with melody, with music in general. Like I have enough familiarity with you to know that you have a deep investment, sensitivity, awareness, and threshold for harmony. And so, as you're beginning your learning of theory, or you're listening to different artists, at first you'll find your threshold is comfortable with basic chord patterns. And most music tends to revolve kind of around 3, 4, 5 different chords. They're the straightforward triads, the sort of the 1, 4, 5, sometimes a 2, sometimes a 6. And the more you spend time with other genres, your threshold of harmony starts to evolve, and you start to lean towards things that are more challenging inside of harmony. So, the next thing you find some people love jazz, and they have a high threshold for the intricacy and the nuance and all of these little delightful aspects of harmony in jazz. And some people find it extremely uncomfortable, and they don't want to listen to that kind of expression of harmony. And so what's really cool about thinking about this more as a threshold than as a good or bad is that it gives permission for someone to like a certain type of music that contains a certain, maybe simple amount of harmony. And it gives permission to someone to like something that's more complex. And these two people don't have to be better or worse than each other, because art is this beautiful, subjective experience. And we could take that kind of example and we could put it into artwork, that looking at something that's really complex might just be too much visual information. And some people might have just 4 circles on a canvas and nothing else, and someone might find that really boring. And as you see more things, your threshold for how much content you can take at once changes, but it doesn't make it better or worse. So another thing, you know, it's one thing to have these melodic, harmonic thresholds. And I think what's really helpful with songwriting is to identify that there are a lot of thresholds inside of this one expression. It's very holistic, which makes it very demanding. And it can be really intimidating because, you know, if you're a poet, you're really delving into a few thresholds. There's your human experience, emotional threshold. There's poetic devices and, you know, metaphor, similes, rhyme. And then you have a form threshold, which is kind of the structuring that you're containing your poetry. But you don't have to worry about music and melody and instrumentation, right? So that's one category. There's writing a novel. You don't have to worry about harmony or melody, but you have to think about setting these chapters in a certain arrangement to make the story really inviting and engaging. So yeah, even instrumentation of like, you get used to a guitar with the vocals and then you're just getting into cajon and oh my God, the possibilities of this percussive instrument. Do I want a 4-on-the-floor pattern? Am I gonna learn more about more bossa nova feels or a 6/8 feel and kind of expanding on meter? And so that's a type of threshold. So I just wanna give so much compassion and acknowledgement to all of you here, that because you're sitting here in the midst of, you know, a songwriting frontier, and it's very vulnerable. It's just intense. It's got a lot of pieces to it. And the cool thing about it is that you're allowed, it's like if each of these pieces have a fader, right? There's form, melody, harmony, instrumentation, emotion, meter, poetic device, right? All of these are part of your songwriting process. You can set those faders as high or as low as you want inside of all of those. So what distinguishes a really talented songwriter from someone who's maybe, instead of saying good or bad, is saying inexperienced or is still kind of experimenting with their faders, is the people that have been doing this for a long time have found some kind of beautiful ratio of these faders. They've decided, I really love poetry. I want to get super deep into the nuance and the creativity behind poetry. And in order to bring that fader way up, I've learned that it's really helpful to bring down the fader of harmonic complexity in some fashion, or the meter of this like melodic complexity. And so that really gives the listener the ability to really pay attention to the poetry. So you'll find genres tend to kind of go through certain kind of faders, right? We've got blues and country. They bring that harmonic fader, not too complex. They give a lot of room for the emotional complexity, right? You've got heavy metal, which brings up the metric fader dramatically, high tempo fader, not always harmonically complex, but sometimes, and if they decide to, you'll find that the poetry is really simple, but it might be really emotionally intense. And these faders, you don't just stumble upon one setting when you're, 18 and say, well, my life is set. I have decided exactly what kind of harmony I like and what kind of emotion I like. Because the truth of the matter is, we are extremely dynamic humans. And as we go through these major phases, we devise different values. We change in our curiosity towards different elements. And those elements are things that are helping us be more multifaceted and more conscious humans in relationship to our world. One more cool thing about threshold. There's this amazing book. It's a primer for poetry and readers of poetry by Gregory Orr. And reading what he talks about with threshold was really life-changing for me, just to learn a more compassionate mindset about curiosity and exploration of feeling and sound. Especially because, one, he put into context the sense of a threshold being the boundary between comfort and discomfort, instead of it being good or bad. So that threshold moving is just a sense of content and receiving and how much you want to take in and how much you don't. And you have the empowerment to choose those differences. But another thing is that these artistic creations, in whatever category, is a threshold between the chaos of understanding our internal world and finding a bridge to connect it with the chaos and the disorganization of our external world. And so by taking that time to create some kind of balance between interacting with the sort of interior of our brains and how we derive meaning, and then also looking outside of ourselves and finding examples of science, of history, of stories, and finding that we're constantly these reactive meaning producing engines in our bodies interacting with this outside thing. And so, going really vague here, songs are a gesture of merging those two things and creating this conversation between this ourselves and this out here, which subsequently creates this other conversation between our bodies in here and other bodies out there. So things to think about with songwriting. First, Jesus, overwhelming, right? It's very easy to want to be inhibited, to be judgmental, to ask a question and immediately answer it. And I have a huge history with having those kind of self-judgments as I'm writing every single thing I'm doing, and just wanting to write things for just not helpful agendas. Like, oh my God, I hope that this makes it seem like I'm a real musician, or I'm going to write this hoping people see that I'm smart, or I'm going to write this hoping that this looks really thorough and deliberate. But all of those things are kind of elements of ego, and they don't really get to the point. And so first thing to think about is, how do you feel? And what do you want to say? In the most simplest way. Because it's this thing of poetry, like, it's one thing with a book, you're trying to kind of add a bunch of stuff to give a whole story, lots of information. Poetry is trying to find the essential elemental component all in its core, and then everything else that's happening is to help bring context to this one big idea. It's trying to give support and a membrane to give context for this one powerful point. And that's why songs have these hooks. That's why they kind of end up going somewhere to say something. So there's the aspect of the, not every song has to have words, but in context of songwriting for singers, I love having a regular practice of journaling and not making the agenda of journaling about writing a song, because you're instantly already inhibiting your brain's ability to explore. So I have an app, Evernote, that I'm obsessed with. At some point I will bring it up and kind of show the tour of it, because it applies to some other stuff. But what I call my journal section, I call it free association, because every time I click on it to write something, I am looking at the title of it with the expectation of, don't do this for a reason. Do this because you have a consciousness and it's healthy to get it out. And sometimes as you're doing this and showing up in some fashion without having an expectation or a condition of outcome, you sometimes stumble upon things you didn't know you were going to find. And then you can start building that clay, because you gave your mind permission, both your conscious and your subconscious self, permission to show up and just get something out. And sometimes it's not even things you would expect to come out. And so that's kind of just on the word side, right? But considering that songwriting is so multifaceted, there's being mindful of the other categories. Something I like to do for melody and harmony is sometimes I will sit at a piano, and I know that I can say I have a music degree, there's some experience there, but honestly, I don't think about that when I'm at a piano. I just allow my hands to sit on the keys and move around and let my hands stumble upon a sound. I will have maybe one chord and I improvise and sing random things over that chord and let myself stumble upon a collection of sound that my body likes. And all of these different things, between writing, between sound playing, between melody improvising, all of these things are kind of like baiting my body to come out and be like, oh, hey, there's something here. It's almost like someone gave you a tarot card and your body's like, oh wow, this thing reminded me of this. I'm suddenly super activated. And the thing is that process is really vulnerable and it's really intimidating, because what if you fail and you don't come up with something, and then that's just so I don't know, you have to cope with feeling like a failure, like the universe rejected you because something magic didn't happen. And that's an example of putting a condition into this relationship that, you know, it's like courting someone. Like it's very passive. There's kind of these like kind of gentle, non-persuasive building blocks. And if you lean into it that way, it's more likely that you're going to come up with something. So let's say that you're not in that mindset. You really are just like, I can't show up that way. It's just not my body. I'm resisting. That happens. And that's totally okay. So another way that you can kind of get your body to kind of come out of the dirt and get excited is to feed yourself with things and realize that everything is fair game for this practice. Whether, you know, I did an exercise before I started this lecture, which I made a list of 20 something songs, and I listed what I liked about each of those songs. What was the thing that, if I'm trying to say, like, why am I excited about this thing? It's so cool. And try to itemize like the top thing I liked about it. And I wrote down a bunch of, there's a bright light, but there's a bunch of song titles here. And then I listed, oh my God, I love this transition they do. I love how they use repetition. I love that they used a familiar song reference. I love that they used a really cool sample. I love that this one guy has this kind of chromatic set of chords together. I love that this one person uses the same melody over and over again in the same word, and the chords are changing while this melody is the same. And so, you know, it's like, it's one thing to have all this education, but it's another thing just to learn how to train your ears to receive your outside world and get curious and excited about it. Because if anything, those two things, the curiosity piece and the excitement piece, are the healthiest remedies for these inhibition, kind of mental health vulnerabilities that we encounter as we're trying to interact this relationship with artistry. So if you get curious about how someone is creating this cool song or drawing a cool thing, or gosh, even the way that speakers talk about things and the way they put pauses in between different stanzas, how they repeat a point when they're talking, like, it's amazing how much food is out there and how nourishing so much of it can be towards your art. And you can't control when these things kind of show up in your work, but if you show up and pay attention and kind of take note of the things you're paying attention to, it's more likely that it's going to end up coming into the world that you're working with as you're outputting different information. So yeah, basically there's this first part of like letting yourself dabble in things and let things come out. There's a second part of dabbling in the outer world, whether it's sound, learning, quick story time inside of that context. I have a song and it's called Veil. And the way that song started was I have a loop station. I made some voices. I randomly harmonized without thinking about what the chords were at all. I just was trying to like make some sounds. And by coincidence, the sound I made was kind of like a buzzing kind of sound. And as I heard it back, it reminded me of bees. And I don't know what that meant at the moment. I didn't know if it was going to warrant anything, it was going to reveal anything. But I felt curious about, okay, it sounds like bees. I wonder if I can do something about bees and it interacts with this song. Maybe. It's a hypothesis. It could be a gift it gives me. It could be nothing. I don't know. But I have to kind of lean in just to see if I find it. So I did a bunch of research on bees. I learned a lot about it. Simultaneously, I was planning a wedding and I was observing my behavior. And I was observing this consistent discomfort in every part of planning a wedding. And so my priority as trying to write a song was to reconcile my confusion about my internal world and the chaos I was having with this inquiry and curiosity about my external world, and trying to see, do they meet? Are they separately interesting? Is this thing for something else? And I'm saying this song because it was a lucky instance where they actually did merge. It's almost like a dating site where these orbs of information are just waiting in your life, and you have these metaphors and you have these little melodies, and one day they meet and they make magic. So what the song showed me was that I was very concerned with gender roles. I was concerned with feeling like I was going to become a submissive wife, that needs weren't important. I felt concerned that there's this societal perception that women are defined in their peak essence of being a woman by this marriage of binding to a man or just reproducing. And I deeply value the reality of women as the creators of life. It's incredible. But I also felt frustrated that I much more aligned with worker bees, which, by the way, are all female. And learning about bees in this way kind of gave me a sense of peace and a sense of like camaraderie with worker bees, that I didn't have to identify my marriage as this like distortion, that I was going to become this submissive, invisible wife figure. So the whole song is kind of dissecting that. But it also, 2 years looking back at that song, I've learned even more about myself through that research, through that song. I learned that my discomfort was because I didn't want to get married. And that song, the hook of that song was saying what I really wanted was intimacy. And there was a foundational challenge in having that close connection in that marriage. So it's like if I had leaned a little bit farther in and I was a little bit higher my threshold for difficult revelations, I might have seen that and not gotten married. And so it's fascinating how much you can learn about yourself by the way that you pay attention. And if anything, it's like regardless of all the semantics and the formatting, everyone's caught up in like, I need to be a good songwriter and I need to be the best and I need to prove something and I've got to come up with this really catchy hook and it's going to prove that I'm good enough. And that's not what this is for at all. It's you're trying to really multifaceted your relationship to yourself. And all of the song stuff is just a flagship of that, but it's not anything defining. Doesn't mean you're good or bad. So, fast forwarding, House of Stairs, for the most part, I feel like that song turned out really good. I got a tattoo because I was so excited about that particular epiphany. But a lot of that music, frankly, I came to realize that it's good to be aware of the chips that you have on your shoulder, because sometimes they can interfere with the art. And my specific chip is that I feel very threatened by feeling stupid, which I think there's a lot of people that actually go through that, which I'm learning more and more as I become more vulnerable to this. But the problem with that fear is that it created my decision-making in my music, where I only wanted to make intelligent poetic choices and intelligent harmonic choices. And the thing is that there's sort of this ratio with kind of between cerebral and emotional. And as much as I was trying to be emotionally connected, and that was my solid drive, all of these like buffers of chip on my shoulder trying to avoid feeling stupid was interfering with the integrity of how emotionally vulnerable I was able to be in my music, because I was caught up wanting to make sure that all these devices were technically sound and approved by the most elite of ears with the highest harmonic thresholds. And so inside of my own relationship to writing songs, there's been quite an evolution in I have not been as big about my metric or harmonic thresholds. I use maybe 4 or 5 chords in a given song, or sometimes 2 chords, because I really just want to be able to focus on the melody having enough space and the poetic confessions being simple enough and direct enough to really have the emotion in the forefront, instead of it being too decorated at the expense of the rawness of it. And that's just one value system, because we have dance songs that are engaging and they help you move. And we have church music, which helps you have context to be in a space and to hold a space a certain way. And so things to ask yourself is how do you feel? What do you want to say? And what feeling do you want that song to give you? Which thereby you're hoping that might translate outward. Because that's going to inform the decisions that you make about what instrumentation you need, what kind of tempo you need, how much or how little harmonic complexity that you're craving for the idea. Because if you really want to hold this beautiful space for harmonic complexity, you probably don't want to put a bunch of ornate floral poetry over it, because then the listener can't hear how beautiful the harmony is, unless that melody is designed to accentuate why that harmony is so beautiful, which is why it's so cool when you hear instrumental music that doesn't have vocals but also is really intricate, because it's designed to let the listener appreciate that nuance and to really bask in that threshold where it's not too much, not too little, but you're just getting to float in this thing that you really appreciate. I also kind of just wanted to throw out a subjective list of more specific things that I like about certain songs. The song Isn't She Lovely? It doesn't have this traditional sort of like verse, pre-chorus, chorus, bridge. Like that's a kind of a very standard pop form, right? You go through a verse or two, you find a way to build the tension of that verse so that you can get to this point. But for him, he just says, isn't she lovely? Isn't she wonderful? Isn't she precious? There's a repetition of the isn't also, that very first word, so that you can kind of connect each of these fibers, but it still feels like it's kind of hanging around one point. He's talking about how beautiful his daughter is. So the entire time you get to hold that head point as you're going through the journey of all these things. So I think it's a good question to ask as you're writing a song is, if you're kind of aware of where that point is, whenever you're making something in the song, ask yourself, is this essential for enhancing this point? Or is this distracting from supporting this point? And that can kind of tell you whether or not you should prune that or not. Another thing is, determining your audience is a great question. If your agenda is you're trying to write this song so that you could tell one person something that you really want them to know, and you didn't know how you could do it with words, so you've got to do a song out of it. The poetry being more informal and being more realistic to what you might actually say to them is going to be more emotionally effective and more communicative in this sort of like, I'm singing to you context. A great person who does that is Al Green, Let's Stay Together. I'm so in love with you. Whatever you want to do is all right with me. It's, from some distance, it looks really basic, but he's letting the music and the melody create this beautiful ratio that just helps you take that in and really soak it. Adele is really good at having this sort of informal presentation. I heard that you're settled down, that you found a friend, that you're married now. There's some rhyme scheme in it, but it still is informal enough where you could believe that she might say that to someone directly. Her hook, never mind, I'll find someone like you. Very informal hook, but just orchestrating never mind, there's something about that word even that carries a lot of emotional feeling. And then you're making it into a small package. Never mind, I'll find someone like you. Done. Cool. And then she doesn't go too far into it. She just lets it sit. So having interludes also is a way of helping give support to something without having to be super wordy about the topic. Your transitions from your verses to your chorus. I love when people make it really quiet for 2 beats or a whole bar before the chorus hits, and then it enables sort of like a pseudo contrast between one section and then this big hit of another. Especially if you want the biggest epiphany to bang when the chorus hits, then making the instrumentation kind of accommodate that can help kind of give this fake accentuation. Techno is really big on that because they don't want the dancers to feel any loss of momentum or dancing. And so techno is just a lead up and another lead up and another lead up and another lead up and another lead up. It's almost like this like series of intros, so that their agenda is to make sure the dancer is dancing. And they don't want to, their poetic threshold is not going to be too high. Their emotional threshold, if they have a lot of emotion, is going to be very poetically simple. And they're really going to get into the meter and the tempo and making sure that they are deliberate in their instrumentation that supports movement. So then a lot of times if something's really emotional and you want to have it be deeply dark and hold space for it, a lot of people have been doing a lot more minimalist instrumentation. A song that I can think of is called Just Before Dawn. The intro is just one note and they kind of just hit sparingly. And then all you hear is that while these vocals are coming in. And it provides this beautiful intimacy. It sets a tone as if you're alone in a room and it's dark and you have this time to reflect on these things, like you're actually asking that question in that room, even if you're not singing to someone directly. Another thing that I really love about music is the element of surprise, because I think there's another kind of like merging in music where you want to find a beautiful balance between things that you're kind of familiar with, things that you like. That's why, gosh, a lot of professionals have to do covers, because the audience wants that kind of merging of this thing they're comfortable with, but also giving them something they're not expecting, and realizing that you can use all of these different meters of melody, harmony, instrumentation, form, poetry, to just use a little seasoning and make it unexpected in just a little fashion, enough where the listener is sold on your idea. So that being said, like examples of ways you can surprise a listener inside of these different metrics. We've got form. Instead of doing 8 bars of an intro, you only do 7, and then you start the song in 7 bars. The listener is thrown off, but it's very intriguing because they weren't expecting it, but it's not too weird. Having something with melody where it's going a certain way and you've heard it go to this one note all the time. I mean, factoring, theory-wise, a deceptive cadence. They perk the ears because suddenly you could not have predicted the future. It is inviting you to the present moment in some fashion. Instrumentation, particularly Andy Schaaf, is a wonderful songwriter. He does this really cool thing. He uses clarinet quite a bit, and he harmonizes them beautifully. And just hearing that soundscape is so novel in this kind of pop context that it makes me want to pay more attention to the music, because it's something different that I'm not used to. Even harmony, I love when I can hear just very slight variations in the chords where they're mostly the same, but something kind of moves up a little bit. Or, gosh, of Montreal is a really weird band where it's almost like they rolled the dice and they came up with random chords and then they threw them all and made a song out of it. That would be an example of a niche threshold, right? Some people love that, and they're so sick of predictable patterns that they're sold. And some people are like, oh my God, I don't even care about what you're saying because this is just too much. It's just weird. Okay, that's fine. The emotional threshold, I have a very easy example because my father and I have extremely different emotional thresholds for different reasons. And I did a concert at the Nash a few years ago, and I did some original music. I did some covers. And the first 3 songs I did at the set were all depressing. And they all have really sad stories. Like one was about Nick Drake's relationship with suicide. And one of them was, an unrequited love song. And they were all sad. He left the concert halfway through because his threshold was so exceeded by this excess of emotion. He did not have the wherewithal to interact with it at any capacity. It just was not of interest to him. That does not mean that sad music has no room to exist, but it just realizes like every single person has a different relationship with that kind of threshold. And that gives me permission to be as emotional as I want to be, and then be here until I find the exact people that really need to show up and be emotional in that way. And then that same person might have a day where they need emotion and another day where they need distraction, and they might need dance music this other day. So in any individual, your listening preferences, your composition preferences, they're liable to fluctuate within an hour, within a day, within a minute. And all this context of different things. What I care about the most with songwriting and with sort of contextualizing kind of like what's most exciting about it to me personally is the pruning aspect of understanding how this process of taking things out after you've let yourself put a bunch of clay out there really is a big testament to the reach and the reception of a song. So I have a student where I was coaching with her, and we spent an hour just looking through every line she wrote and trying to think of how can we trim this line to be as concise as possible. A lot of singers often will put a lot of connecting words inside of their explanations of, I saw that you were doing this. How can you take that and you can make it, you did this. And then the way that succinct expression feels different than I saw you did this to you did this. being persistent with the song in that way and just slightly re-angling a word or two really pops a phrase, especially with a chorus, because the chorus, the fact that you're trying to bring to one space and hold it in a certain way, it needs to be as pure as possible and super simple, because you're trying to engage memory, you're trying to engage the listener to have that souvenir of that thing when they leave, and to have it where they want to come back. So if anything, songwriting is often a merging between marketing and storytelling, because you want this captivating story and you have to be mindful of where you put the pieces of that story as it builds, and where the logo is going to end up, where people understand why this is all in front of them. So it's like if you don't feed them enough form to kind of contextualize that, if you make the listener a little confused and feel kind of disorganized in how to understand and reconcile the emotion and identify things, taking home, trying to get to the essence of what you're trying to say was one important thing. Two, make sure that your clay phase of allowing things to come up is separated from your sculpting phase, which is where you take what you have and you pare it down. If they cross-contaminate, you're not going to be as experimental or as innovative in the things that you come up with. That kind of childlike wonder gets muddled a little bit. And if you're creating too much while you're sculpting, it doesn't give you an opportunity to sort of refine and figure out the essentials of this adventure that you went on, to then sort of be like, here's the book notes for the audience of what I got from this adventure. And it saves you time, because I put all this time into it so that you could feel this final point. Another thing I want to say quickly about poetic device is say what you want to say. And then the cool thing about metaphors is sometimes even if you say exactly what you felt and what you want to tell someone, it's really hard for people to fully understand the world the way that you see it. And that's why metaphors and visual references and putting a room around this thing that you're saying helps invite the other listener to empathize with your experience and give them this world that they didn't have to live personally. Like it's this vicarious exchange of experience. One of my favorite starting lines is a song called Balmy Night by Department of Eagles. And he starts the line with, "By yellow light, this balmy night's too long." And I am enthralled with the fact that this man said the phrase "by yellow light," and how that somehow put me in a room where the room is dark and there's one little lamp on the side, and it gives me the quality of the type of lamp, and that there's this dimness. And then when he says this balmy night's too long, he could be outside, but the fact is it gives the sense of like I'm alone, the lighting is sullen, and I feel unpleasant in it. It was one line and it gave an entire location and context, so that when his emotion arrived in that scene, the listener has a way higher opportunity of feeling exactly what that artist felt when he wrote that line. So the more you lean into listening to songwriters and how they set a scene, how few words can you use to tell someone what kind of room you're in, to tell the listener what piece of the room should they focus on that actually has something to do with the story. How your body moves towards this next thing, and using the right word to talk about the way the body is moving, so that you can feel the emotion inside of how the body is moving. So poetry oftentimes will kind of go into finding just a subtle combination of conciseness that surprisingly informs a lot of information without having to have a paragraph of information about it. Especially too, listeners are way smarter than we give credit, and they can take a lot from a little. And they kind of like to take a lot from a little because they have their own story and they get to create their own story. And having that ratio gives them that permission to go with their own world of it. I wrote a song about depression, and I had a first line that was practicing my coffin pose. And my friend was like, "Oh, I love meditating to that song." And I thought, I was like, this is like a scene of depression. And he's like, "Oh, this is such a reverent scene for me." I didn't say, "Hey, I'm really sad, and so I am in this like lifeless pose." You get to kind of imply what that scene translates to. Yeah, I think that's I think that's the gist of kind of where I wanted to start with, is really just sharpening your sensitivity and your ability to identify that you like things, to get excited that you like it, and then to pair that with asking why you like it, really makes experience more exciting, because it's just like a little gift, like learning why things are so cool. And I have to say that in this process of creating this class, it was deeply healthy for my own writer's block relationship with songwriting, because a fundamental challenge that I feel with writer's block is feeling like it's pointless, like everything's pointless. I get really kind of nihilistic about why bother, or that this is stuff that everyone's done. But the truth of the matter is the process, if you remember how fun it can be, then it doesn't really matter what it comes out to be, because regardless of like all the cool things you might end up creating and like these sort of thresholds that you could to achieve with a flagship, the rabbit hole of listening and sensitivity and writing can feel really exciting in live time. Oh yeah, I remembered one more thing I was going to talk about. Organizing songwriting is another thing. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys how I organize information for songwriting, because another thing that is really overwhelming for me sometimes is I have a lot of ideas and I don't know how to store them all, and I don't remember what I've worked on. And so here we go. I'm going to share the screen in a second. I'm just going to also get the 3 pillars out. I call it the 3 pillars, and I'm going to show you why real quick. Here we go. Sharing that. Okay, so what you're looking at is, I love this app. You can do a premium subscription. You can also do a free version. Here's my 2020 stuff. So 3 pillars. I've got, first of all, I have a place to store my feelings. So here's what happens, right? I've got this sort of free association journal, and it's just vomiting out everything and not thinking about it till after. And then I'll look back through these journals I've written, and I'll look through and surmise, okay, is there something in here that seems like it's song friendly? Like that, I think I could do more with it, but maybe I don't know how. So I then will transfer these free things into feelings. I also have information. So if I find something randomly interesting, maybe this will be a cool scene setting for a song, almost like a fiction novel. Then I'll do research on, like, I found scapegoat really interesting in thinking about a conflict of blaming. So, I'll go in and scapegoat, and I can copy paste research that I've done to learn about words. I often love to look at the etymology of words to find out where they came from, in case that rabbit hole of word history gives me more scene setting inside of learning stuff. So this is also a way of exercising the muscle of curiosity, is just letting yourself randomly learn things. And I don't know if this will become a song someday, but I find it fascinating. And someday I might have an emotion, and my metaphor reference of a scapegoat will have so much research and information that I will be able to draw from it in real time and actually be able to kind of subtly reference a scapegoat to help me kind of resolve something I'm going through. I also did some research on Alice in Wonderland, just to think about like a female role. I spent 2 years researching radical feminism and Joan of Arc and Mark Twain to write a song about feeling empowered inside of being a woman. And that song took 2 years because I did way too much research. And also I have a place to store sounds. And so the way that I acquire these sounds is, if you're collaborating with someone and you guys have a practice of improvising, or if you are improvising with yourself, anytime that I go and I sit to make a sound, I record it, because just in case I wander off and I stumble upon something, I've got it here, and I don't have to freak out that I didn't remember what it was. I can go and re-relate to my past self and transcribe what I did. Especially sometimes you might stumble upon a really cool transition that you didn't know you could come up with, but it just came out in the world, and you want to like lasso it down and put it into an arrangement. And so I have a bunch of stored recordings, and then I can go in if I was really trying to develop it. One instance is I have a song called Waveless in here somewhere. I might have transferred that one. But sometimes I'll have 4 or 5 files on the same idea, because I'm experimenting with where I can take this idea. without trying to forget everything that's been manifesting, because that's the hardest part about this ongoing evolved relationship with songwriting. And so, you know, as I kind of briefed earlier, it's the sense of, you know, songwriting is such a broad floating pool that's holistic and it contains so many elements. It's just overwhelming. And they're all floating away from each other, and someday magic happens because this merger happens between a feeling you've had, a phenomenon in the world that you've discovered that you really like for some reason, and sounds that you're just like, God, I just dig that because I dig it. And it kind of feels like this. And then this emotion kind of feels the same way. Oh my God, they're going to get married and it's going to be really great. So then I have another file, it's called synthesis, which is where I have discovered that there's a merging between all three of these things. And then I can start this sort of pruning process where I've gathered clay, and now I can take the time and put the flowers together and make the bush trimmed up and make the garden look really cool. And that way, I also have a sense of all the files that are not done yet, but they are ready to really lean into. And that way, if my mood is reverential and I have a reverential idea or an angsty one or whatever it is, I've got something that I can lean into. So when they're completed, I have another file here where songs that I've finished and all the research and all the components that went into it all now get to have resolve and get to get out of my bank, and they get to be put somewhere for an archive, because there's nothing like having so much disorganization that you cannot tell the difference between what is needing to be discovered, what has been discovered and needs to be finished, and what is already finished. And so I thoroughly love this because I'm really OCD and I love organizing thoughts and arranging different things. And it just, I don't know, makes me feel safe. Oh yeah, hi Ken, I see your question of what the app is called Evernote. And I've had it for years and I'm consistently obsessed with it. I also have a file in that's called Free Association. And it looks similar, where a bunch of Post-its are stored, and it just gives me a space to kind of type on a blank slate and get thoughts out without any expectation or condition of what those thoughts are going to be or what they're going to feel like. Gosh, I'm so grateful to all of you for being here. I can't tell you how much I love this stuff and how much I don't want people to feel the psychological pains that I feel as I'm interacting with this formidable art form, because it is so beautiful when you can get past that hump, and it is such a sadness that our self-judgments can get in the way of these things that are just so beautiful inherently. Beth, you've asked about collaborating. Collaborating is interesting. I find it really fun if someone brings an idea and I can help them sculpt it. I find it often really intimidating if I have an idea and someone's trying to help me sculpt it. It's sometimes really cool. It just depends on where my emotional threshold is and if I feel some kind of emotional resolve in the discovery, because otherwise you'll find it's like so vulnerable to still kind of be in progress of this thing you're going through and that you don't understand, and the lack of understanding of it is really overwhelming. I've had that band House of Stairs for about 6 years, and the way that we collaborate together is enabling sort of this free association of sound that's being made and just kind of letting improvisation evolve something. And then I'll improvise vocally over it and see how that evolves. And then we kind of come together and kind of surmise what that song feels like and what could come of it. And I usually end up referencing my own emotional life to then put the lyrics and melody on top of this other thing. So that kind of saves me some overwhelm in feeling like I have to come with every single thing. So that's another thing too, is if you find yourself feeling overwhelmed by a certain category and you're like, you know, I'd love to be great at this, but I'm just not, that's a great opportunity for collaboration, because maybe your threshold for poetry and emotion is really here, and someone else in the world is like, I love this harmony threshold, but man, that's really cool, and I need someone that's really here, and we can merge these together. That gives a better opportunity to find those ratios in balance, because you're finding people that have just the right strengths of threshold that you're craving, that maybe you haven't invested time into yet to get to that point of the threshold. Especially even drums, like I have some awareness of percussion. My beatboxing exists, but the world of wisdom that drummers have and their ability to interact with space and time is just deeply inspiring. Okay, the relationship of the clay phase and the sculpting phase. So the clay phase is just trying to bring in essence the idea of building material, of getting the resource, of just gathering everything in the front of the room without doing any kind of sorting or judgment. Because that's the thing about being this like inner child of wonder, is that what's so cool about children is they just ask, they just like, they don't think about having to filter anything out. They're sponging the world, and they're excited about what they're excited about, and it's just 100%. And so giving that kind of sacredness to that kind of clay building experience of gathering sound and gathering thoughts and gathering feelings and not trying to control it gives way more opportunity to gather really cool stuff that doesn't get blocked off by things you're scared of or things that are bad. Or I feel like the good bad judgment is one of the most counterproductive experiences in creating, because it's so subjective and it's not useful. There's so many other words you can use. You can say it's vague. It's way less shameful than it's bad. And things can be vague. That's totally okay. You know, see, it's like it gives more permission. So that way, this clay phase is completed. You've gotten the mound, and you're ready to figure out what it all means and how to really set it and really polish the stone a certain way so that this thing shines. And then, so that would be the sculpting phase, where you're really taking all the words out that are not essential and are not enhancing. I'm guilty of using like 5 or 6 metaphors when I'm writing, and it's a little bit too much. So it's really cool if you can kind of get your metaphors down and figure out like prioritizing your metaphor. And that way, instead of having 6 different scenes of things that relate to this one idea that's a lot to take in for a listener, you can say, I really want to talk about plants, and I want to make sure that everything I'm doing is supporting plants and not about plants. Here we got this building here too, and we got this the slide back here, really involved with plants. That it's just a lot of information for a listener to navigate an emotional experience, or the metaphor is enhancing the point. It's not trying to take the stage. You know what I mean? So that's the role of sculpting, is to make sure that these things are not getting in the way of what the music is trying to serve, which is expressing something, and it is connecting with you and someone else. Gosh, connection. It's so beautiful. And it's such an art form of learning how to really connect and how to shape things to make connection stronger. Even when you think about communicating conflict with a person. If you give an entire essay of your life story, and what you actually need to tell the person is, hey, that thing that you said, the tone you used, that tone actually, that made me uncomfortable. They don't want to hear your life story to contextualize that little exchange, unless that exchange happened once when you were 6 and you want to bring that up to support that. See what I mean? Like, so it's kind of sparing the whole essay and figuring out what exactly is really going to connect that point to a person. That's a great question, Carlos. Thank you. Elizabeth, fantastic question with the faders, which, by the way, I have like a little like baby chart behind the screen. So I will type those faders out and like have it in an email, but to review them, which you might find more. But one of them is form. So dealing with interacting with verses and pre-choruses and choruses and bridges and AABA, and the sense that there's like a stock way that people interact with it, and there's like a sort of a threshold where you might grow to be antsy about stock forms, and you kind of want to manipulate a little bit, and certain artists kind of mess with that in a really fascinating way. So there's form. Melody, whether you want to kind of get into neighbor tones, some gaps, or gosh, this one song I heard recently starts with a really big gap and then has a bunch of repeating notes right after it. I'm like, that is so cool. I never thought of that. And you could just take that platform and be like, maybe I'm going to start a song with a big gap and some similar tones, because that had a cool effect. I wasn't expecting that. Or gosh, I can talk to Beth all day about cool melodies, because there's like Midnight Sun, her lips are like a red and ruby chalice. That song has such a cool melody to it. But to be fair, that might exceed the threshold for certain listeners. They might not want to have such a beautiful, like intricate movement of melody through a song. Or gosh, the Peacocks, we can talk about that for quite a while. I can even write that down, some really cool melody songs. Okay, so fader 2 is melody. Fader 3, harmony. Whether you want to stick with sort of diatonic progressions, whether you want to challenge the diatonic ear, which is things that are kind of in the standard scale of a song, and change just by a little bit or by a lot of it. Instrumentation, whether you want to go with stock instruments and have the full-fledged drums, bass, guitar, keys, or if you want to throw in something really strange like a clarinet or a bassoon or a really random sample that's not really familiar. And kind of throwing in that threshold of things you haven't heard before. But if you have a bunch of white noise that's really poorly mixed, that might be beyond the threshold that you like. Another thing is emotion, which is subjectively my favorite, just having psych history. It's, you know, whether you want to stay in a safe space because maybe you've been through a lot and you're not feeling that, or you've been through stuff, but you haven't been comfortable interacting with it, but you want to. So then you're wanting to test that emotional threshold. And, you know, I'll quick tangent on this guy personally. I've been constantly trying to push the boundary of my vulnerability. And every time I write a song that I think is going to be too melodramatic, that people are not going to accept me for, that is just melodramatic and 17 or whatever, you know, all those things that we do with that, it ends up being rewarding. And I end up being more connected to people than not connected to people by really admitting things that are really profoundly impactful and things that are really difficult. Because we all go through these things, and part of what makes them hard is thinking that we're the only ones. So that's what's cool about music, is that it exposes so much universality of our experiences in a way that's ingestible. You know, so going through depression stuff and writing a song about it, I thought that would be like shameful, but it really helps. So I'm constantly, that's like my drive when I'm writing songs, is I'm trying to think of like, where's my threshold with emotion, and how can I push it farther so that I can handle more, and push it farther so I can handle more. And a lot of pop artists might have a really dramatic emotion, and they're like, well, how do I buffer the fader so that this really dramatic thing can be received? And they'll put a really perky chord progression, and they'll have a lyric about their tongue getting cut off and blood coming out of their mouth. And you don't even realize how dramatic that is, because it's just got this like cute little minor, like major chord, and it just has this really great movement. It just makes you like want to drive and go on a bike ride, but there's blood, there's a lot of blood. So that's the thing too, is that if your goal is to get a lot of listeners to like what you're doing and that you care about that, that's where you want to get into the fader system and like really try to dial in the ratios so that the listener can really take it in and not be so resistant to this thing that you really want to introduce in a very inclusive way. And there are rooms for people that want to be exclusive, and they want to bend the threshold because they want to, and they're allowed to do that. And you just find that not as many listeners are going to want to listen to that, and that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's selective. It's like it's fitting in a spectrum. Okay, meter percussion, whether you get into polyrhythms, whether you get into fast tempos, or whether you are in 4 or you want to be in 3 or in 5, or whether you want to do mixed meter and have some parts have bars of 3 and then throw in a bar of 4, or whether you want to deal with certain Latin grooves and the ways that the instrumentation can stack on one another and how many stacks you would want. All of these things are kind of part of rhythmic threshold of things that you like to hear, or when you just feel like there's too much rhythm going on and it's overpowering your agenda. And then finally is poetry, where leaning into learning about devices of poetry, of rules about how rhyme works, ways to kind of phrase starting sentences that are powerful or that are raw enough. One favorite thing is that you don't have to rhyme all the time in songwriting. People always assume like, okay, every stanza has to make sense in a rhyme scheme, and you don't really, like, it's kind of cool sometimes, but it kind of becomes too predictable and too safe in a threshold when you're over rhyming in a very formulaic way. And so if anything, in the history of poetry, there's a lot of form, structure, rhyme scheme in the early history of poetry. And then free poetry has emerged in the present, in the past 100, 200 years. And it's really impacted songwriting as well, that artists crave being able to manipulate those things with poetic devices to their own end in their own moment, instead of, it doesn't say structure is bad. It does enable in some ways to have restriction that you kind of mess with, or if you want more freedom, then you would interact with poetry that way. I love internal rhymes where you kind of have the rhymes, instead of being the end of a line and the end of a line, you're having them inside of one line, and it kind of gives you that feeling like the rhyme is happening, but without the predictable landing of it. I hear that a lot in hip hop, especially, that there's not this sort of specific location where these rhymes are happening. They just kind of are flowing through, a very like human thing. Another thing, as far as melody construction and merging that with poetry, I try to honor the human phrasing as much as possible when I'm creating a melody. So if you've got a statement where you were never there, is a phrase, right? I would want the melody to kind of let never have the time, whether it's by putting it higher in the pitch, or by having it be a little bit slower, or by having the main syllable of the main word landing on a beat that gives it oomph. So whether someone has that on the downbeat of a measure where you have a pickup, you were never there, or you have it on beat 2, where often beats 2 and 4 kind of have these landings. So that's a whole other world of thinking about how to compose your lyrics inside of a melody and kind of placing it. And that would be kind of also sculpting, of like designing sort of a specific location for the most like expressive part of your epiphany and giving it the time that it needs, no pun intended. The book by Gregory Orr, my gosh. Okay, yes, Gregory Orr. It's in my purse, which unfortunately, it's like a primer for poets and readers of poetry. And it looks like I said readers. Oh my God, it's one of my favorite. I'm almost done with it. I'm not done with it yet, but I got it recommended from a friend. And it's like having like the compassionate mother you've always wanted that's just watching you as you're creating, like, hey, this all fits in a spectrum. You are part of the whole world and you are sharing this experience, and exactly where you are fits somewhere in here. And having that mentality is so much more enabling and inviting than this, like, we're in this exclusive club and you can only enter if your metaphor is cool enough. And that's really frustrating. And I feel that way way too often. So I can't recommend that book enough. It's just, God, he's so cool. He's so cool. He's been teaching for decades. On the commercial aspect, have I submitted to music libraries to get licensed? I haven't. I have a very low threshold for marketing and business. That's the thing, is as I even I'm obsessed with that word. As I sit with it, it's like, oh, all this is a distinction between comfort and discomfort. It is not a distinction between smart and stupid. The composite of my life experiences has resulted in this learning and this prioritizing. I have not gotten to that one yet because I get anxiety as I'm researching and figuring out how to send it, and vulnerability. But I do have the intention of gathering the help that I need to delegate that process, to try to send, especially for film, because the stuff that I'm creating nowadays, I really dig creating soundscaping that supports in a very mood sense, so that the sort of minimalist, raw poetry kind of has this sort of visually cinematic kind of vibe to it. I will get back to you if I get some more experience on that end, because that's, yeah, very, the money side of all this is very frustrating and often not very profitable. But there definitely are publishing companies, and they look for certain things, and they crave like simplicity, and like, we just want a hook that has something about movement or go, or we are together. And like, this part's really boring, and figure out how to make that creative, but that's what we need. And we like this really simple instrumentation to go with it. And the business is not really wanting this like huge, like dramatic gorgeous version of creativity where you get to show off every aspect of your thresholds and how great they look in their metrics. So that's humbling because most people don't care exactly where you put your thresholds, but they care about where theirs are and if you can meet theirs. If anything, that's probably a really big trend professionally, is that clients kind of have where they're at with music and they want you to meet them there. And if you know how to do that and have a soul at the end of it, probably not so bad. But if you get too frustrated with that, you probably shouldn't do it, because then you're not going to want to do music anymore, because you're not honoring your own self and what matters to you, because you're constantly hiding that and determining that all of this stuff is more important. About being mindful of sort of the listener's capacity for listening. I don't know how many times you guys have been to a funk concert or something that's really experimental where a saxophone player solos for 6 minutes straight. And that's allowed. And sometimes, James, sometimes that person has 6 minutes worth of really cool things to say. But sometimes you end up feeling like, oh, wow, you really can play scales. Again, really, I heard that was another scale. That was, wow, that scale was really good. That was another one. Wow, I need another scale from you, just because I don't know for sure yet, but I'm pretty sure that you've got like 6 minutes. At that point, that's not about them. That's about you. And I mean, how many early improvisationalists will do that same thing where they're so new at it that they don't know about the reverence of space, and so they're so caught up in feeling like they're allowed to do this. So I'm going to give everything I've got and not allow any space, and it doesn't serve the music. And bands do this very easily, where they get so caught up in feeling validated and seen that that fear and that craving interferes with what the music actually needs, and you end up getting overwhelmed by too much. Yes. Yeah. So, and it makes collaborating a very delicate balance. It's like dating. Like, how often do you collaborate with someone, you're like, oh my God, that solo was egregious, or wow, that subdivision was excessive. There was no space. I cannot breathe. Please let me breathe. Like, all those things, when you find someone that just really lays back and chills, and then you have the space to do the nuance of this thing you wanted to do, like, it makes them look really good. And for the astute listener, they know, like, wow, that piano player is really good. So, the average listener might not take that into account, especially when you think about like singing, performing. Like, a lot of singers first go to is, how many runs can I do? And how big can this belt be? Because that's going to impress everybody, and everyone has a threshold to appreciate that. But as you listen to more singing and more technique and more stuff, you're going to find that simplicity and just holding a note and just letting it exist and giving it space. There are certain listeners that have a really high threshold to really appreciate that, and it's worth leaning into, even if you're not going to get attention from a very large group of people for what you just did, because the music is being served, and the people around you making music with you are being served. And if anything, space is just great. Anytime that you can give the sacred appreciation to space in your music, in your art, if you put space in your canvas, you put space in your sound, put space in your movement, it is space in your talking, in your listening. Oh my God, it goes such a long way in every aspect of connecting. Yes. Yeah, I feel like we are of sound similar mind of this reverence for space, and I'm so grateful. And yeah, just be compassionate with yourself, and don't call yourself bad, and don't tell yourself that you suck, because you wouldn't want to ever tell your kid that. And we're all just big kids, and we're all going to stumble upon things that we start when we're 70 or 75, and that's so cool. So just many, many thanks to all of you for being here, and all the best to your endeavors of whatever art form you do, because they are all great.